Okay, so this is the second day. I'm going to talk about motivated thinking. And so far today, I've gotten through the second third of the article. So there's one third remaining. And I'm purposefully doing this for several reasons. But the reason it's taking me a while to really think about this article is because of the type of questions that I ask myself and because of the type of goals that I do have. One of the things the article by Molden and Higgins does by looking at other studies on motivation is they kind of create a summation and ways to think about things. And what I do is I take an article like this and apply it to my goals, apply it to what's happening in my life, apply it to our surroundings, and really to make a point. So one of the reasons it's taken a while is two reasons. The article talks about two types of, I think that's the non-directional motivation, and that is the need for accuracy and the need for closure. And I've seen both of these operating in my life and in my curricular development and also with other people over time. And I want to say one of the reasons, like they talked about, accuracy versus closure often determines the length of time we might engage with material, while the search for accuracy, as they noted, may not necessarily always lead to let's say the best or right judgment per se. The need for accuracy or closure does influence the length of time we're willing to engage in processing information. And so they mention it, it talks about quantity. And so part of my goal is to seek accuracy. And one of the things that motivates that is the lack of information, very in keeping with what the article talks about. The lack of information. And we see this operating on many, many different levels. We see it operating in positive ways or in negative ways. I know for me, part of my work as a researcher, is to create articles and to submit them for review. And because of the lack of information in terms of the goals, that are aligned with my goals, it takes more out of me to provide that evidence because what I do does not necessarily align with mainstream thinking, mainstream articles, necessarily the paradigms of the day in my field or in most fields in education in general. What ends up happening is I'm usually asked more for the evidence. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It just makes it does make things harder, but it also, for me, in the end, I end up with the best products. And I do have to say, I have articles coming on to two big articles that was never published for that reason, mainly because it conflicts with a certain thinking. But I do plan to use it. And it'd be interesting to see how this information plays out and influences perhaps even some of the readers, because my niche is so small that I can actually see, in certain topics that I'm looking at, I could actually get an idea and put a perimeter around, which scholars might actually have read it. And so going back to understanding, motivated thinking from this perspective, my goal is to seek accuracy. And so it has led me in so many different directions. When I first started, I didn't really know where to start because my goal, and again, this is today I'm talking about non-directional, but just a little bit about directional. My goal was to make sure I was able to sift through a lot of the negativity, to figure out and understand and to bring to the forefront what our science capital and even our cultural capital was. Something I talked about in my book. But I continue, it's something I continue to delve into. It's something that I'm patient about continuing to work on it because it does require a lot of thinking. It requires, it takes a great deal out of us for those who want to look at that. But most of all, oftentimes this goal to seek these different truths might conflict with, the goals for our field, right? We have to produce We have to create things. We need to, and I'm not saying for me particularly, but if you're a textbook company, to sell things. And so, or if you're whatever you are in, if you're a curriculum developer, then you need to sell things. And so what ends up happening is the need for closure. Sometimes, as the book talks about, the need for closure influences the length of time we might engage with understanding. The book does talk about how that influences both our information processing, or rather in this case, quantity. And so where this ended up being a conflict was this. Part of my goal was to create curricula that was representative of the best of Black heritage, but not necessarily in the way people think about it. A lot of times when we think about representation, we might just put a Black scientist or a person. I wanted to really understand how this even has infused into our culture, and not just the material things, but the ways of thinking, especially when it comes to understanding the influence of symbolism. But what happens as part of this? So I began by creating what I call practitioner articles, because I was really making sense of what this meant in practice. But then I needed to get to the next level of putting it into research. So for the field, and it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that I was rushed to try to create a type of closure by publishing research articles as well, because it forced me to be creative. But it took a lot out of me. I suffered a great deal of burnout trying to figure this out. And it was really hard because of the way I was thinking about it, teaming up with people to get this done at the time was really difficult, because I realized this was something that I was already leading in some way and ahead in my thinking about this. The idea of motivated thinking as influenced by, or I should say non-directional motivated thinking, as influenced by our need for accuracy or closure, comes up in other ways, even amidst the curriculum development and amidst me being involved with other people. Sometimes one of the things that has come up is when people are doing the search or trying to figure this out, they might often create a product where they've gone through and had this amazing finding an amazing experience, but then the final product doesn't really do that for students. So what ends up happening is that they've had this amazing experience, but the outcome on creating something that looks attractive and beautiful to everyone ends up really taking away from the student themselves having that similar experience themselves. And so those are the things that I've considered, which is why I've always focused on processes. And so throughout thinking about this, I started with the end in mind. Where I wanted this to end up with, I wanted students to be able to engage in similar conversations. And I'm going to do a whole episode on questions. But oftentimes, the research shows the type of questions we ask and people ask are often close-ended or lead to yes or no. And I wanted to make sure that whatever I created, that didn't happen in the end. So oftentimes, the need for accuracy depends on what type of accuracy we want. Oftentimes, our search for accuracy ends up, as even another researcher, several people have noted, we take a reductionist approach, where we often reduce things to categories, and mostly for closure. And this is one of the conflicts. This has been a conflict for me, because I find that even when I'm in spaces collaborating and having conversations where people might think categorically, it allows them to get to the end, but I'm still in a different place, and it just makes it really hard to follow. And then I think, wow, I need to just go off and do this on my own, because I've already thought of the end and seeing how this will go in terms of implementation. And partly because when I create curricula, I also want to understand the processes, because it allows me to think about what processes students are going to engage in. And so I guess that brings me to the question of AI, because people talk about AI, that's the big topic of the day. One of the reasons that I'm not as worried about AI is because I focus on the processes, and I focus on what it is that these processes bring out. And I really do believe that AI at the end of the day is going to end up being used for people who are successful, for the unimportant things that you don't want to waste your time on. I don't think it's going to be used for the and be important for the knowledge producing areas. At least I want to say not just yet, but I really don't. I think that just like we would do a Google search to check sources, we're still going to need to check sources always if we're going to be accurate knowledge producers. And so even if we asked AI for an interpretation. And so when it comes to thinking about our non-directional influence, or I should say non-directional motivated thinking, is thinking about our own need for closure and whether or not that's always a positive thing or a negative thing. One of the things that would come up often is students' need for closure. And as the research shows, and we know by Dewey's popular quote, and like Molden and Higgins' research shows, oftentimes this need for closure suspends thinking, okay? Or in cognitive science, it reduces the time spent with information processing, and the time spent with considering alternative perspectives. Now, I know I'm not doing this article justice, which is why I've attached a link. I get nothing from actually making a recommendation of the paper, but I think that, if it's something to think about, because we see motivated thinking influencing how evidences look like, influencing ideas about truth, influencing ideas about learning. And we can combine that with what we talked about in the last episode with directional motivated thinking, which, according to researchers, influences quality, what information we choose to attend to. Now, it's important to note when it comes to thinking about information, we have to really understand curriculum development and understand learning, because the information we provide to students, if the information is already biased, then it really doesn't matter what questions they come up with. It really doesn't matter. A lot of things don't matter if the information is already slanted. And so part of my goal is really thinking about information source, what students would look at, what might even prompt students to explore more. Now, here's the thing. The truth doesn't always prompt people to want to know more about the truth. And so the truth may have an impact negatively or positively. And it may affect people wanting to know more or not wanting to know more. And I love the studies that were cited in this paper when it comes to how people reacted and which stages this may lead people to want to learn more or not want to learn more. So in the next episode, I'm going to look at the last third of this paper and figure out how this applies to education, how this applies to our thinking, and how we can use it in our own classroom. But I want to sum up by saying this. There are different types of closure. Some are good and some are bad. And when it comes to closure, if the type of closure we want just relates to a right or wrong answer, then we've reduced our classroom conversations to those one word or those two words. And we've limited the ability to have those rich conversations. And so one of the things I do love about engaging with our students. One of the things that comes up is because the information out there isn't necessarily the evidence that we might need to support our own goals and our own thinking. So it leads to these rich discussions as to what this really means and as to why and as to figuring it out. And I mean, we go back and forth, having conversations about it, having conversations about questions. And so, understanding who are and how to develop thinkers is really tricky if you yourself don't want to engage in the process of thinking about it. Okay, so let's continue to talk about this, motivated thinking, how it affects the classroom. And if you like this podcast, please follow and like, and look forward to the next episode.